Harper stood in that Navy bar wearing a faded military patch while bikers laughed and called her a fraud. They had no idea she'd once saved 17 lives in classified operations that officially never happened. Then a legendary SEAL captain walked in and everything changed. Like, if you want more incredible military stories, subscribe for new episodes and comment where you're watching from right now. The fluorescent lights of the roadside bar cast an amber glow through the rain-streaked windows as laughter erupted from a corner table. Harper Lowell sat alone at the bar, her untouched plate of wings growing cold, the condensation from her beer bottle pooling on the scarred wood beneath her fingers. The Naval Air Station Oceana lay just beyond the parking lot, its runway lights blinking steadily through the downpour. She'd driven here after her first week as a civilian contractor, hoping for anonymity among the mix of military personnel and locals who frequented Murphy's Tavern. Instead, she'd found herself the center of unwanted attention. Lieutenant Bradley Knox leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying over the classic rock playing from the jukebox. "I'm serious, guys. Look at that patch." He gestured toward Harper's worn leather jacket hanging on the back of her bar stool. Even from across the room, the faded insignia was visible, a barely legible A-57 beneath what looked like constellation markings. "Where'd you get that, sweetheart?" Knox called out, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. "Military surplus store having a clearance sale." Harper's knuckles whitened around her bottle. She kept her eyes fixed on the amber liquid, watching the bubbles rise in perfect, predictable patterns. The familiar weight of judgment pressed down on her shoulders, the same weight she'd carried for 3 years since returning to civilian life. "Come on," pressed Sergeant Mike Torres, Knox's drinking companion. "That's an Orion patch, right? Those units were disbanded years ago, probably picked it up at some flea market." The bartender, a grizzled ex-Marine named Eddie, glanced between Harper and the increasingly rowdy table. He'd seen enough military personnel to recognize the subtle signs. The way Harper held herself, the measured breathing, the careful stillness that spoke of training she couldn't quite shake. Knox stood, emboldened by alcohol and audience. "Seriously, lady, that's stolen valor territory. You can't just wear unit patches like fashion accessories." Harper finally turned, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I earned it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Knox blinked, momentarily taken aback by the quiet certainty in her tone, then recovered with a bark of laughter. "You earned it." He looked around the table for support. "Sweetheart, I've been Navy for 8 years. I know every active and reserve unit on the East Coast. A-57 Orion doesn't exist." Harper slid off her bar stool with fluid precision, her jacket brushing against her forearm as she reached for her wallet. The patch caught the light, faded blue thread forming what might have been a constellation. The numbers, 57, barely visible beneath years of wear. "Doesn't exist anymore," she corrected, placing a 20 on the bar. Eddie watched her gather her things, noting the way she automatically scanned the exits, the unconscious check of her surroundings that marked her as someone who'd operated in hostile territory. Professional interest flickered in his weathered features. Knox wasn't finished. "Right, so you're telling me you were in some secret squirrel unit that nobody's heard of. What's next? You gonna claim you were a door kicker?" Harper paused at the door, rain drumming against the glass. For a moment, her reflection overlapped with the darkness outside, a ghost caught between two worlds when she spoke. Her voice carried the weight of memories she'd never shared. "I was a lot of things, Lieutenant, most of them classified." She pushed through the door into the rain, leaving behind the warm light and cruel laughter. Knox's voice followed her into the parking lot, something about wannabe operators and pathetic fantasies. But the words were lost in the storm. Harper sat in her truck for a long moment, engine running, wipers struggling against the downpour. Her fingers found the challenge coin in her jacket pocket, tarnished bronze that had once gleamed, its edges worn smooth by 3 years of nervous handling. On one side, the Orion constellation. On the other, coordinates that no longer existed on any official map. Through the rain, the lights of Naval Oceana beckoned like distant stars. Tomorrow she'd return to her job calibrating training weapons, invisible among the pilots and technicians who saw only another civilian contractor trying to make ends meet. They'd never suspect that the quiet woman adjusting rifle sights had once held coordinates to extraction points that saved lives they'd never know were at risk. The laughter from Murphy's Tavern grew louder as more personnel arrived. Seeking refuge from the storm, Harper put the truck in gear and drove toward the base housing where she'd rented a small apartment. Anonymous, forgettable, safe behind her. Knox regaled his expanding audience with the story of the wannabe operator and her costume jewelry military patch, never imagining that by morning, his casual cruelty would set in motion events that would expose truths buried deeper than classified files. The rain continued to fall, washing the night clean of everything except memory. The morning sun slanted through the hangar's industrial windows, casting long rectangles of light across the concrete floor, where Harper knelt beside a disassembled M4 training rifle. Her movements were precise, economical, hands that had learned their trade in places where a single misaligned component could mean the difference between extraction and abandonment. "Pass me that torque wrench," she said to Marcy Hoffman, her assigned partner for the weapons calibration contract. Marcy, a cheerful woman in her 40s who'd worked civilian maintenance for a decade, handed over the tool with practiced efficiency. "You're fast," Marcy observed, watching Harper adjust the rifle's sight alignment with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. "Most contractors take twice as long on initial calibrations." Harper's response was a slight nod, her attention focused on the weapon's internals. The familiar smell of gun oil and metal shavings grounded her in the present, though muscle memory kept trying to pull her elsewhere, to moonless nights in valleys that officially didn't exist, where silence was survival and precision was prayer. Across the hangar, a group of Navy pilots clustered around a coffee station, their conversation drifting over the mechanical sounds of maintenance work. Harper caught fragments, something about a new squadron rotation, complaints about the rain, casual speculation about the weekend's plans, normal talk from normal people living normal lives. She envied them their certainty. "Harper, you okay?" Marcy's voice pulled her back. "You went somewhere else for a second, just concentrating." Harper reached into her jacket pocket, fingers finding the challenge coin she carried everywhere. 3 years, and she still couldn't break the habit of checking for it. A talisman from a life that had ended as abruptly as a blown mission. The coin was warm from her body heat, its raised constellation marking familiar against her fingertip. 57, Operation Orion, classified so deeply that even its existence had been scrubbed from official records, leaving behind only fragments, a few personnel files with missing pages, equipment manifests with blacked-out serial numbers, and memories that felt more like hallucinations with each passing year. "Miss Lowell," the voice belonged to Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, barely 22 and eager to prove himself among the seasoned maintenance crew. He approached with the swagger of someone who'd never learned that volume wasn't the same as authority. "Yeah," Harper looked up from her work, noting automatically how Morrison positioned himself, blocking her light, claiming space, asserting dominance through proximity, standard intimidation posture, amateur level. "Chief wants to know if you've got experience with electronic firing systems. We've got some new training modules that need integration testing." Harper considered her answer carefully. The truth was that she'd helped develop some of the Navy's current electronic firing protocols during her time with Orion. She'd field-tested systems that wouldn't be declassified for another 5 years, troubleshot equipment failures under conditions that would make a normal person question their sanity. "I can handle basic diagnostics," she said instead, keeping her voice neutral. Morrison snorted. "Basic diagnostics, right? Look, lady, I don't know what your qualifications are on paper, but this is real Navy equipment. If you mess something up, people could get hurt during training exercises." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut. Harper set down her tools with deliberate care, then stood with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned movement from masters of violence. Even at 5'6", she seemed to fill more space than Morrison expected. Frequency modulation on electronic firing systems operates on a 2,4 GHz spectrum to avoid interference with standard communications equipment, she said, her voice never rising above conversational level. "Safety protocols require triple redundancy on failure modes, with manual override accessible within 2 seconds of system fault detection. Training modules integrate through standard MIL-STD 1553 data bus architecture." Morrison's swagger faltered. "Those weren't specifications you learned from a manual. The electronic firing systems also require daily calibration checks on impact sensors," Harper continued. especially in high humidity environments like coastal installations. Failure to maintain calibration can result in false readings that compromise training effectiveness. She paused, letting the technical specificity hang in the air like gun smoke. Will that be sufficient for your basic diagnostics requirements? Petty Officer Morrison! The young sailor opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Across the hangar, several other maintenance workers had paused in their tasks to listen, their expressions ranging from surprise to grudging respect. Marcy whistled low. Where'd you learn all that? Harper knelt back down beside the rifle, her hands resuming their methodical work. Here and there, the challenge coin seemed to pulse against her ribs where it rested in her inner pocket. Through the hangar's open bay doors, she could see the runway where FA-18 Super Hornets sat in neat rows, their weapons pylons empty but ready. Once, she'd provided targeting coordinates for aircraft just like these. Once, she'd been part of something that mattered more than morning equipment checks and petty territorial disputes. Now she was just another contractor, invisible and underestimated. But invisibility, Harper had learned, was its own kind of weapon. The mess hall at NAS Oceana buzzed with the familiar sounds of military dining, metal trays clattering against tables, conversations mixing into white noise, the occasional burst of laughter cutting through the general din. Harper sat alone near a window, overlooking the flight line, picking at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard, and watching FA-18's taxi for afternoon training flights. 3 tables away, Lieutenant Bradley Knox held court with his usual audience of junior officers and enlisted personnel, his voice carried easily across the space, animated by the previous night's encounter and embellished with each retelling. "I'm telling you, this woman is completely delusional," Knox declared, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. Sitting there in Murphy's wearing some fake unit patch, probably ordered it online, when I called her out. She actually tried to claim she earned it, like we're supposed to believe some contractor was running classified ops. Sergeant Torres laughed, shaking his head. The Stolen Valor crowd gets more creative every year. What's next, claiming to be a Navy SEAL? That's the thing, Knox continued, warming to his theme. She wasn't going for the obvious stuff. No SEAL Trident, no Special Forces tab, just some made-up unit patch that sounds official enough to fool civilians. 57 Orion. Probably watched too many movies about secret space programs. Harper kept her expression neutral, though her jaw tightened imperceptibly. The challenge coin in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each word, its familiar weight a reminder of truths she couldn't defend without destroying lives that depended on their continued burial. "You know what we should do." Knox leaned forward conspiratorially. "Call her out officially. Get Chief Morrison to run a background check. Maybe request her personnel file. When it comes back showing she was never military, we expose her publicly. Clean up the base of wannabes and frauds." The suggestion gained momentum around the table. Harper watched their faces, noting the eager anticipation of vindication, the righteous anger of people protecting something sacred from perceived contamination. She understood the impulse, had felt it herself when confronting actual stolen valor cases during her active years. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the administrative office. "Report to Conference Room B at 1400 for credential verification. Bring all documentation." Harper stared at the message, her pulse steady despite the obvious trap being sprung around her. Knox must have followed through on his threat, possibly even faster than he'd anticipated. Her official personnel file would show exactly what it was designed to show: a civilian contractor with security clearance but no military service record. The real documentation that proved her Orion service existed in files so classified that accessing them required presidential authorization. She finished her sandwich mechanically, each bite tasteless but necessary fuel for whatever came next. Around her, the mess hall continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the drama building at Knox's table. "There she is," Torres said quietly, nodding toward Harper. "Should we tell her what's coming?" Knox considered this, his expression shifting between cruelty and calculation. "Actually, yeah. Give her a chance to come clean. If she admits the fraud, maybe we can handle this quietly. But if she keeps lying..." He stood and walked over to Harper's table, his posture radiating confident authority. Behind him, his audience watched with the anticipation of spectators at a public execution. "Miss Lowell," Knox said, stopping beside her table. "Mind if I sit?" Harper gestured to the empty chair across from her. noting how Knox positioned himself to be seen by his audience. This was theater as much as interrogation. "I wanted to give you an opportunity," Knox began, his voice pitched for maximum audibility. "We've got a credential verification meeting this afternoon, background checks, documentation review, the whole 9 yards. If there's anything inaccurate about your service record, now would be the time to clarify." Harper met his gaze steadily. Such as whether you actually served in any military unit, particularly one called A-57 Orion. Knox leaned back in his chair, confident in his position. "Because here's the thing. I've been Navy for 8 years. I know units, I know patches, and I know when someone's trying to pass off fantasy as fact." The mess hall had grown quieter, conversations tapering off as people sensed drama in the air. Harper could feel dozens of eyes on her, measuring her response, waiting for the crack in her facade that would validate their suspicions. "And if I maintain that my service record is accurate?" she asked. Knox's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then you're calling me a liar in front of half the base personnel, and when your background check comes back clean of any military service, you'll be exposed as a fraud in front of the same audience. Your choice. Come clean now and maybe keep some dignity, or double down and face the consequences." Harper stood slowly, her movements controlled and precise. She picked up her tray, balanced it easily in one hand, and looked down at Knox with an expression that revealed nothing. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "you have no idea what you're asking for." She walked away toward the tray return, leaving Knox surrounded by expectant faces and the sudden, uncomfortable sensation that he'd just made a mistake whose dimensions he couldn't yet comprehend. The conference room felt smaller than its actual dimensions, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the standard-issue table where Harper sat facing 3 officials. Chief Morrison occupied the center position, flanked by the base's security officer and a civilian administrator whose primary job seemed to be taking notes. Lieutenant Knox stood near the door, his earlier confidence intact but somehow less assured in the formal setting. Through the room's single window, Harper could see maintenance crews preparing aircraft for evening training flights. Normal people doing normal work while she faced questions that could unravel everything she'd built in 3 years of careful anonymity. "Miss Lowell," Chief Morrison began, consulting a manila folder, "we've received some concerns about your background documentation, specifically claims about military service that don't appear in your personnel file." Harper's hands rested flat on the table, steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat, its familiar weight grounding her in truths she couldn't speak. "What specific concerns?" she asked. Morrison glanced at Knox, who straightened and cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you've been observed wearing military unit insignia, specifically a patch claiming affiliation with something called A-57 Orion. When questioned about this, you claim to have earned the patch through military service." "That's correct." The simple acknowledgement hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. Morrison flipped through several pages, his frown deepening. "Miss Lowell, your file shows civilian employment history, security clearance documentation, and contractor credentials. There's no record of military service anywhere in your background." Harper nodded slowly. "That would be accurate for the records you have access to." The distinction was subtle but significant. Morrison caught it, his expression sharpening. "Are you suggesting there are records we don't have access to?" "I'm suggesting that some service records are maintained outside normal personnel systems." Knox stepped forward, his patience finally fraying. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's exactly the kind of answer someone gives when they're caught in a lie. If you served, prove it, show us orders, discharge papers, something real." Harper reached into her jacket's inner pocket, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Knox tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, but Harper withdrew only the challenge coin, tarnished bronze that caught the fluorescent light like captured starlight. She placed it on the table with a soft metallic sound that seemed to fill the room. Chief Morrison leaned forward, his maintenance-trained eyes automatically cataloging details. The coin's face bore the Orion constellation in raised relief. 13 stars arranged in the precise astronomical pattern. The reverse showed coordinates that appeared to be latitude and longitude, though the numbers meant nothing to Morrison's experience. "Challenge coins can be purchased online," Knox said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Anyone can buy military memorabilia. Harper's finger traced the coin's edge, feeling the microscopic imperfections that marked it as genuine military issue rather than commercial reproduction. This particular coin was issued to 3 people. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who died in a helicopter crash in 2013, Master Sergeant David Reeves, who was killed by an IED 6 months later, and me. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of jet engines spinning up on the flight line. The coordinates on the reverse, Harper continued, her voice barely above a whisper, marked the location of an extraction point that saved 17 lives during an operation that officially never happened. The operation designation was Orion. The unit code was Alpha 57. Morrison studied the coin more carefully, noting details he'd initially missed. The bronze had the particular patina of age and handling that was difficult to fake. More importantly, the woman across from him spoke with the precise, economical language of someone who'd lived with classified information long enough to know exactly how much she could say. If this operation was classified, the security officer interjected. How do we verify your claims? Harper met his gaze steadily. There's someone on this base who would remember, Knox scoffed. Who? And don't tell me it's some convenient witness who just happens to be here. Captain Elias Merrick, Harper said. Navy SEAL, currently assigned as a special warfare advisor. He was the sniper team leader during Orion's final extraction. He'd recognized the coin. Morrison's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Merrick's name carried weight throughout the special operations community, a legend whose reputation was built on missions that existed more in whispered rumors than official records. Captain Merrick is, Morrison paused, checking his watch, actually scheduled to arrive this evening for a consultation on training protocols. Harper nodded. Then you'll have your verification. Knox looked between Morrison and Harper. Sensing the shift in the room's dynamics but unable to identify its source, the certainty that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to crack under the weight of details he couldn't explain away. This is ridiculous, he said finally. We're supposed to take her word that some special ops legend is going to vouch for her fantasy military career. Harper stood, her movement fluid and controlled. She retrieved the challenge coin from the table, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. Lieutenant Knox, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd given orders in places where hesitation meant death. You wanted proof, you'll have it soon enough. She walked toward the door, pausing only to meet Morrison's eyes. When Captain Merrick arrives, show him the coin. Ask him about Orion. Ask him about extraction coordinates that saved 17 lives in an operation that never officially happened. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a room full of people who were beginning to realize they might have seriously underestimated the quiet contractor they'd dismissed as a fraud. The base's administrative wing buzzed with subdued activity as evening approached. Harper found herself in the unusual position of waiting, something she'd once been trained to do with infinite patience, but had lost the taste for during 3 years of civilian predictability. She sat in the corridor outside Chief Morrison's office, watching Navy personnel move through their end-of-shift routines while the weight of the afternoon's confrontation settled around her like familiar armor. The challenge coin rested in her palm, its surface worn smooth by years of nervous handling, a talisman from a life that felt increasingly like someone else's story. Through the thick glass of Morrison's office door, she could see shadowy figures in animated discussion. Knox paced behind the chief's desk while Morrison made phone calls, his expression growing more troubled with each conversation. The security officer had disappeared an hour ago, returning with a stack of files that seemed to raise more questions than they answered. Harper understood their confusion. The military bureaucracy was designed to track every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine through an intricate web of documentation. Service members left paper trails wherever they went: personnel files, training records, medical histories, security clearances, duty assignments, performance evaluations. The absence of such documentation was almost impossible to explain within the system's normal parameters. Almost. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention to the corridor's far end, where a small group of officers moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to being obeyed. At their center walked a man in his early 50s, gray threading through close-cropped brown hair, posture radiating the controlled lethality that marked true special operations veterans. Captain Elias Merrick. Harper's pulse quickened despite her efforts to remain calm. She hadn't seen Merrick in 3 years, not since the debriefing that had officially ended her military career, along with any hope of official recognition for Orion's successes. He looked older, weathered by missions she could only guess at, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him legendary within the special warfare community. Merrick's gaze swept the corridor with automatic professionalism. Cataloging threats and exits before settling on Harper, he stopped mid-stride, his expression shifting from routine awareness to something approaching shock. "Jesus Christ," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the corridor's ambient noise. Ghost, the nickname hit Harper like a physical blow, carrying with it memories of moonless nights and impossible extractions, of coordinates called in from positions that shouldn't have existed and couldn't be officially acknowledged. Ghost, because she'd moved through hostile territory like something between human and myth, leaving behind only rescued lives and enemy confusion. Harper stood, her movement automatic and precisely controlled. "Captain," Merrick approached slowly, his escort hanging back as they sensed something significant happening beyond their understanding. When he reached Harper, he stopped just outside arm's length, close enough to confirm she was real, far enough to maintain the professional distance required in public. "I heard you were—" Merrick paused, his voice carefully neutral. "I heard you'd transitioned to civilian life 3 years ago." Harper's response was equally careful. Aware that their conversation was being observed by people who lacked the context to understand its full significance, Morrison's office door opened, and the chief emerged with Knox close behind. Morrison's expression suggested a man grappling with information that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. "Captain Merrick," Morrison said, his voice tight with professional strain. "Thank you for coming. We have a situation that requires your expertise." Merrick's gaze moved between Morrison and Harper, his special operations training automatically processing the dynamics at play. "What kind of situation, Chief?" Knox stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching desperation. "Sir, we have a civilian contractor making claims about military service that can't be verified through normal channels. She's claiming to have served in some classified unit called A-57 Orion, and she mentioned your name as someone who could vouch for her." Merrick's expression didn't change, but Harper caught the minute tightening around his eyes that indicated rapid mental calculation. He was assessing how much truth could be safely revealed, weighing operational security against other considerations she could only guess at. "I see," Merrick said finally. "And what specifically are you asking me to verify?" Morrison held out the challenge coin, its bronze surface catching the corridor's fluorescent light. "She claims this is authentic military issue, connected to classified operations that you were involved in." Merrick took the coin with hands that remained perfectly steady despite whatever internal storm the sight might have triggered. He studied both sides carefully, his thumb tracing the raised constellation pattern with the familiarity of someone who'd once carried an identical piece. The silence stretched until Harper could hear her own heartbeat. "This coin," Merrick said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "was issued to exactly 3 personnel involved in classified extraction operations. 2 of those personnel died in the line of duty. The third," he looked directly at Harper, his gaze holding truths that couldn't be spoken in public. "The third saved more lives than anyone in this building will ever know." The small auditorium that normally hosted safety briefings and training presentations had been hastily converted into a formal inquiry space. Harper sat at a table facing a panel of senior officers, the challenge coin resting on the surface between her and Captain Merrick, who had taken a position to her right that somehow managed to be both supportive and officially neutral. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. The room buzzed with personnel who'd found excuses to attend, drawn by the promise of resolution to a mystery that had consumed corridor conversation since the mess hall confrontation. Commander Sarah Blake, the base's executive officer, called the proceeding to order with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to cutting through confusion. "This inquiry has been convened to address questions regarding Miss Lowell's military service record and her authorization to wear unit insignia." Blake's gaze moved between Harper and Knox, who sat several rows back, his earlier bravado replaced by the pale tension of someone beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. "Captain Merrick," Blake continued, You've examined the challenge coin in question. Is it authentic military issue? Merrick stood, his movement fluid despite the weight of the moment. Commander, the coin is authentic. It was issued as part of a classified program designated Operation Orion, conducted under Joint Special Operations Command from 2011 to 2013. A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the audience. Knox shifted in his seat, his face reflecting the dawning understanding that he'd wandered into waters far deeper than anticipated. Can you verify Miss Lowell's participation in this operation? Blake asked. Merrick's hesitation lasted only seconds, but Harper recognized it as the pause of a career military officer calculating how much truth could be safely revealed. Miss Lowell served with distinction in multiple classified operations. Her tactical expertise and operational knowledge saved numerous lives during high-risk extractions. The formal language couldn't capture the reality of what Harper had done. The impossible coordinates she'd called in from positions that existed only in the margins between life and death. The evacuations she'd guided through terrain that defied both mapping and sanity. But it was enough to establish the fundamental truth that her service was real. Blake nodded, making notes on her legal pad. And the unit patch she's been observed wearing. Authentic and earned. Merrick's voice carried the flat certainty of someone stating objective fact. The A-57 Orion designation was classified under Special Access Program protocols. Personnel records were maintained separately from standard military files for operational security purposes. Harper watched Knox's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and the first stirrings of panic as the implications of his accusations became clear. Around the room, other personnel who'd participated in the ridicule began to shift uncomfortably, suddenly aware they'd been complicit in humiliating someone whose service record dwarfed their own. Lieutenant Knox, Blake said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, you initiated these proceedings based on your belief that Miss Lowell was engaged in stolen valor, in light of Captain Merrick's testimony. Do you wish to revise your position? Knox stood slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment and something approaching fear. Ma'am, I had no way of knowing about classified service records. Her file showed no military background. Because, Merrick interjected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Her file was supposed to show no military background. That was the point of the classification protocols. Blake's expression suggested she was rapidly losing patience with Knox's excuses. Lieutenant, you publicly accused a decorated veteran of fraud without conducting any investigation beyond checking standard personnel files? Did it not occur to you that someone with legitimate classified service might have documentation that you lacked the clearance to access? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Knox opened his mouth, closed it, then managed a weak, "No, ma'am." Harper had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now she stood with the fluid grace that marked her as different from the personnel around her. The room fell silent as she prepared to speak. Commander Blake, she said, her voice carrying across the auditorium with quiet authority. Lieutenant Knox acted on the information available to him. The classification protocols around Orion were designed to make us invisible, even to our own military family. His suspicion was understandable. The magnanimity of her response seemed to make Knox's earlier cruelty even more stark by contrast. Around the room, personnel who'd laughed at Murphy's Tavern or shared in the mess hall ridicule found themselves confronting the uncomfortable reality of their behavior. Merrick reached into his jacket and withdrew something Harper hadn't seen in 3 years. A small case containing a second challenge coin, this one pristine and unmarked. He placed it beside Harper's worn bronze disc, the contrast highlighting the weight of years and memory. This coin, Merrick said, was meant for the ceremony that honored Orion personnel after the program's conclusion. That ceremony never happened for operational security reasons. Miss Lowell and her teammates never received the recognition they'd earned. He paused, his gaze moving across the assembled personnel. Today seems like an appropriate time to correct that oversight. The hangar had been transformed from its usual utilitarian purpose into something approaching a proper ceremony space. Work lights had been repositioned to provide even illumination, and a small podium had been erected near the main doors, where the late afternoon sun slanted through in golden bars that seemed almost theatrical in their timing. Harper stood at attention as personnel filed in. Not the curious crowd that had gathered for the inquiry, but a smaller, more select group that included senior officers. the maintenance crews she'd worked alongside, and several civilians whose presence suggested they held clearances high enough to be briefed on classified operations. Chief Morrison approached the podium, carrying a manila folder that Harper recognized as containing the fragments of documentation that had survived Orion's official erasure. Behind him, Captain Merrick held a small wooden case whose contents Harper could guess, but tried not to anticipate. Commander Blake called the assembly to attention, her voice echoing in the hangar's vast space. "We are gathered to address and oversight an official recognition that has persisted for 3 years. Miss Harper Lowell served with distinction in classified operations that saved numerous lives and advanced critical national security objectives." The formal language felt strange after years of invisibility, but Harper maintained her posture as Blake continued reading from a prepared statement. Around the hangar, faces that had shown skepticism or indifference now reflected varying degrees of respect and curiosity. The nature of Miss Lowell's service required that her achievements remain classified and unacknowledged through normal channels. However, recent events have provided an opportunity to offer appropriate recognition within the bounds of operational security. Morrison opened his folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "Miss Lowell, by the authority vested in the base commander and at the recommendation of Captain Merrick, you are hereby formally recognized for exceptional service during classified operations designated under the Orion program." Harper's hands remained steady as Morrison continued reading, though she felt the weight of 3 years' accumulated silence beginning to lift from her shoulders. The challenge coin in her pocket seemed to pulse against her ribs, its familiar presence now joined by the promise of official acknowledgement. "Your tactical expertise, operational knowledge, and dedication to mission success directly contributed to the preservation of life and the achievement of strategic objectives under conditions of extreme adversity." Merrick stepped forward, the wooden case open in his hands to reveal a medal Harper hadn't expected to see. A simple bronze star, surrounded by a constellation of smaller decorations, mounted on a ribbon that bore the subdued colors of special operations. "This citation," Merrick said, his voice carrying across the hangar with the authority of someone who'd stood in similar ceremonies for fallen comrades, "represents not just individual achievement, but the sacrifice and dedication of personnel who serve in shadows so that others may live in light." He approached Harper with the measured pace of military ritual, stopping precisely at arm's length. The medal caught the hangar's mixed natural and artificial light, its bronze surface reflecting the same warm glow as the challenge coin that had started this entire confrontation. "Miss Lowell," Merrick said formally, "on behalf of the personnel whose lives you preserved and the mission you served with honor, thank you." Harper accepted the medal with hands that betrayed no tremor, though inside she felt something she'd thought permanently lost beginning to stir back to life. The weight of the bronze was negligible, but its presence seemed to restore a balance that had been missing since her transition to civilian life. Around the hangar, applause began tentatively before growing to fill the space with genuine appreciation. Even Knox, who stood near the back of the assembly, joined in the recognition, his expression suggesting someone grappling with the magnitude of his earlier misjudgment. As the ceremony concluded and personnel began to disperse, Merrick approached Harper for a private word. The years hadn't changed his economy of movement or the intensity of his pale blue eyes. "Ghost," he said quietly, using the call sign that carried memories of impossible missions and extractions that had redefined what a single operator could achieve. "How are you handling the transition?" Harper considered the question, weighing 3 years of adjustment against the events of the past week. "Some days better than others, Captain, today. Today was a good day." Merrick nodded, understanding the weight behind her simple words. "The community needs people like you, not necessarily in operational roles, but sharing knowledge, training the next generation, if you ever want to contribute without the full commitment." He left the offer hanging, but Harper heard the invitation clearly. The possibility of purpose without the weight of full classification, of sharing hard-won expertise without disappearing back into shadows she'd worked so hard to leave behind. "I'll consider it," she said, and meant it. As Merrick walked away, Harper remained alone in the hangar, holding the medal and watching the last of the personnel file out into the Virginia evening. The challenge coin in her pocket no longer felt like a burden of buried truth, but like a bridge between the person she'd been and the person she was still becoming. For the first time in 3 years, The future felt like something worth planning for. The Virginia evening painted Naval Air Oceana in shades of amber and gold. As Harper walked across the tarmac toward the parking area, the medal rested in its case inside her jacket pocket. Its presence both foreign and familiar, a weight she'd forgotten she'd carried until it was restored. Behind her, the hangar where the ceremony had taken place glowed with artificial light as maintenance crews resumed their evening routines. The base was returning to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in Harper's relationship to this place and these people. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcy. "Drinks at Murphy's to celebrate? The whole crew's going." Harper paused beside her truck, considering the invitation. Murphy's Tavern, where this entire confrontation had begun 3 nights ago with Knox's casual cruelty and public humiliation. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, though she wondered if returning to the scene of her original humiliation would feel like victory, or simply the closing of a circle. Another text arrived, this one from Chief Morrison. "Miss Lowell, if you're interested, we have an opening for a senior weapons systems consultant. The position would involve training development and protocol revision. Full security clearance required. Interested?" Harper stared at the message, recognizing it as exactly the kind of opportunity Merrick had hinted at. A chance to contribute without disappearing back into classified shadows. To share expertise without sacrificing the identity she'd built over 3 years of civilian adjustment. A third text from a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Lowell, this is Lieutenant Knox. I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I can express in person. If you're willing to accept it, I'm buying the first round at Murphy's." The gesture surprised her. Knox had looked genuinely shaken during the ceremony, his earlier arrogance replaced by what appeared to be authentic remorse. Harper had seen enough character under pressure to recognize when someone was grappling with a fundamental revision of their worldview. She looked back toward the hangar, then at her truck, then at the direction of Murphy's Tavern beyond the base gates. 3 options: solitude, celebration, or confrontation with the scene of her humiliation. 3 years ago, she would have chosen solitude without hesitation. Tonight felt different. Harper started the truck and drove toward the base gates, decision crystallizing as she moved. Murphy's it would be, not as a victim returning to the scene of injury, but as someone who'd reclaimed her story and was ready to write its next chapter. The tavern's parking lot was fuller than usual, crowded with vehicles she recognized from the base, through the windows. She could see the maintenance crew gathered around their usual table, along with several officers who'd attended the ceremony. Even some of the personnel who'd participated in the original ridicule seemed to be present, their expressions suggesting people grappling with uncomfortable self-reflection. Knox stood near the bar, holding 2 beers and scanning the entrance with the nervous energy of someone awaiting judgment. When Harper walked through the door, conversation dimmed as heads turned toward her, but the atmosphere felt different from her previous visit, expectant rather than hostile, curious rather than dismissive. Harper approached Knox directly, accepting the beer he offered with a nod of acknowledgement. "Lieutenant, Miss Lowell." Knox's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent hours crafting an apology and was still uncertain of its adequacy. "I need to say something, and I'm not sure words are sufficient." Harper waited, noting how the tavern's other patrons maintained respectful distance while clearly listening to the exchange. "I was wrong," Knox said simply. "Not just about your service record, but about the assumptions I made, the way I treated you, and the cruelty I showed someone who deserved respect. There's no excuse for that behavior." Harper sipped her beer, studying Knox's face for signs of performance or manipulation. She found neither, only the uncomfortable honesty of someone confronting their own capacity for callousness. "Apology accepted," she said finally. Knox's relief was visible, though Harper sensed he understood that forgiveness didn't erase the weight of his actions. Around the tavern, other personnel seemed to exhale collectively, as if her response had given them permission to approach with their own awkward attempts at reconciliation. Marcy appeared at Harper's elbow with characteristic timing. "So, what's the plan? Back to calibrating training rifles, or are you taking Morrison's offer?" Harper considered the question while watching the tavern's patrons settle into what appeared to be a genuine celebration, rather than an uncomfortable, obligatory gathering. The evening felt like an ending and a beginning simultaneously, the conclusion of 3 years of invisible existence and the potential start of something that honored both her past service and her civilian identity. "I'm thinking about it," Harper said, and realized she was thinking about more than just Morrison's job offer. She was considering Merrick's suggestion about training the next generation, Knox's genuine attempt at redemption, and the possibility that her story might include chapters she hadn't yet imagined. Outside, the Virginia night settled over Naval Air Station Oceana with the peaceful routine of a military installation at rest. Inside Murphy's Tavern, a group of people who'd begun the week as strangers or antagonists found themselves navigating the complex territory of recognition, respect, and the possibility of something approaching community. Harper raised her beer in a quiet toast to whatever came next, confident for the first time in years that she was ready to face it. The Monday morning briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana held an atmosphere of anticipation that had nothing to do with the standard weekly schedule review. Harper sat at the conference table's right side, wearing civilian clothes but holding herself, with the unconscious military bearing that had become more visible since the ceremony. Commander Blake presided over the meeting with her usual efficiency, but there was an undercurrent of something different in her approach, a recognition that the week's events had shifted dynamics throughout the base in ways that would take time to fully understand. "Miss Lowell," Blake said, consulting her agenda, "Chief Morrison has submitted a request to formalize your position as Senior Weapons Systems Consultant. The proposal includes training development responsibilities and protocol revision authority. Before we proceed, I'd like to understand your intentions regarding this opportunity." Harper had spent the weekend considering exactly this question, weighing the appeal of increased responsibility against the complications of deeper integration into the base's operational structure. The challenge coin rested in her pocket as always, but its weight felt different now, less like a burden of hidden truth, and more like a bridge between past and future. "Commander, I'm interested in the position. My background gives me insights into training gaps that could benefit current personnel, and I believe I can contribute to protocol development in ways that enhance both safety and effectiveness." Morrison leaned forward from his position across the table. "Miss Lowell has already demonstrated exceptional technical knowledge. Her weapons systems expertise exceeds what we typically see from contractors, and her understanding of operational requirements suggests experience that could significantly improve our training programs." Blake nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "Captain Merrick has also submitted a recommendation supporting Miss Lowell's increased involvement in training development. He's specifically requested her input on special operations preparation protocols." The mention of special operations training caused Harper's pulse to quicken slightly. It suggested a level of trust and official recognition that went beyond ceremonial acknowledgement, an invitation to contribute expertise that had been gained through experiences most personnel would never face. "There would be conditions," Blake continued. "The position requires enhanced security clearance review and background investigation. Given the classified nature of your previous service, this process might take longer than usual." Harper understood the implication. Any serious background investigation would uncover fragments of her Orion service, requiring careful navigation by security personnel who lacked full context for what they might find. It was a risk, but one that seemed manageable given the week's developments. "I understand, Commander. I'm prepared for whatever investigation is necessary." Knox entered the briefing room at that moment, carrying a manila folder and wearing the subdued expression of someone still processing the magnitude of recent revelations. Blake gestured for him to take a seat, her expression suggesting this interruption was planned rather than coincidental. "Lieutenant Knox has requested to address Miss Lowell regarding his conduct during the recent inquiry," Blake said. "Miss Lowell, you're not required to participate in this discussion, but Lieutenant Knox has indicated he has something formal to present." Harper studied Knox's face, noting the careful preparation in his posture and the weight of whatever he carried in the folder. This felt different from the Tavern apology, more official, with implications beyond personal reconciliation. "I'll listen," Harper said. Knox opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on the table where Harper could see it clearly. It was a formal letter of commendation, written on base letterhead and signed by Morrison, Blake, and several other senior officers. "Miss Lowell," Knox began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "I wrote this commendation because I believe your technical expertise and professional conduct deserve formal recognition beyond the apology I owe you personally." Harper scanned the document. noting language that praised her weapons systems knowledge, professional bearing, and contribution to base operations. It was the kind of recognition that could significantly enhance her civilian contractor profile and open doors throughout the military contractor community. The commendation will be placed in your personnel file, Knox continued, and copies will be forwarded to relevant contracting authorities. It's not enough to undo the damage I caused, but it's a formal acknowledgement of your value to this base and to the military community generally. The gesture was more substantial than Harper had expected, suggesting Knox had put considerable thought into concrete ways to repair the professional damage his accusations might have caused. It was the kind of thorough remediation that indicated genuine remorse rather than mere embarrassment. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Harper said. "I appreciate the recognition and the effort you've put into this." Blake collected the commendation and added it to Harper's growing file. "Miss Lowell, assuming the security clearance review proceeds without complications, when could you begin expanded duties?" Harper considered the timeline, weighing her existing contractor obligations against the appeal of more meaningful work, the possibility of training the next generation of personnel, of sharing hard-won expertise in ways that could save lives. Felt like exactly the kind of purpose she'd been missing during 3 years of anonymous equipment calibration. "I could transition gradually over the next month. Commander, complete current projects while beginning consultation on training development?" Blake nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Chief Morrison will coordinate the details with you directly." As the meeting concluded and personnel began to disperse, Harper remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the week's transformation. 7 days ago, she'd been an invisible contractor calibrating training weapons and trying to forget a past that felt increasingly like fiction. Today, she was being offered the opportunity to reclaim her professional identity and contribute expertise that had been buried under classification protocols. Merrick appeared beside her as she gathered her materials. "Ghost," he said quietly. "Welcome back." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Harper understood she was being welcomed not just back to meaningful work, but back to a community that valued her expertise and recognized her contribution. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never quite allowed herself to believe still existed. "Thank you, Captain," she replied. "It's good to be back." 6 months later, Harper stood in the same hangar where she'd once knelt beside disassembled training rifles. But now it buzzed with the focused energy of personnel engaged in advanced weapons systems training. The space had been transformed into a comprehensive learning environment, complete with simulation equipment, technical displays, and the kind of hands-on training stations that Harper had designed based on her understanding of how people learned under pressure. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Martinez worked methodically through an electronic firing system diagnostic, her movements reflecting the precision that Harper had spent weeks drilling into her newest class of weapons system specialists. Around the hangar, 20 other personnel practiced procedures that Harper had developed by translating classified experience into teachable protocols. "Miss Lowell," Martinez called out, "I'm reading a frequency modulation error on Channel 7. Should I switch to backup systems or troubleshoot the primary?" Harper approached Martinez's station, noting automatically how the young officer positioned herself for maximum efficiency and minimal exposure. Habits that Harper's training had reinforced through repetition and explanation, rather than the harsh experience that had taught Harper the same lessons. "What does the diagnostic protocol tell you about frequency errors?" Harper asked, her teaching style favoring guided discovery over direct instruction. Martinez consulted her manual, then rechecked her readings. "Protocol says to verify signal integrity first, then check for interference sources before switching to backup. But the error reading is intermittent, and intermittent errors usually indicate what? Environmental interference or component degradation." Martinez's confidence grew as she worked through the logic Harper had taught her. "So I should check for external signal sources before assuming hardware failure." Harper nodded approvingly. 6 months of teaching had reinforced her belief that the best instruction came from helping personnel understand the reasoning behind procedures, rather than simply memorizing steps. The young specialists in her program learned faster and retained more because they understood the why behind the what. Correct. Run a spectrum analysis on the surrounding frequencies. If you find interference, note the source in your log. If the hardware is degrading, You need to know the failure pattern for future reference. Chief Morrison approached from across the hangar, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone delivering significant news. His relationship with Harper had evolved from skeptical authority figure to collaborative colleague over the months since her official appointment as senior weapons systems consultant. Miss Lowell, I've got your next assignment. Special request from Norfolk Naval Station. They want you to review their advanced training protocols and provide recommendations for improvement. Harper accepted the clipboard. Scanning the preliminary briefing materials, Norfolk represented a significant step up in responsibility and visibility, the kind of assignment that could establish her reputation throughout the broader military contractor community. Timeline, she asked. 2 weeks for initial assessment, then ongoing consultation as needed. Captain Merrick specifically requested you for the project. Apparently, Norfolk has some training gaps that match your particular areas of expertise. The mention of Merrick's involvement suggested this assignment might involve more than standard training protocol review. Harper had learned to read between the lines of official requests, and this one carried undertones of the kind of specialized knowledge that had made her valuable during her classified service around the hangar. Her current class continued their exercises with the focused attention of personnel, who understood they were receiving training that exceeded standard military education. Harper had built the program by combining technical expertise with hard-won operational experience, creating learning opportunities that prepared her students for realities they might face but hoped they'd never encounter. Knox appeared in the hangar's doorway, now wearing the collar insignia of a lieutenant commander, a promotion that Harper had quietly supported through her professional assessment of his growth over the past months. His transformation from casual bigot to thoughtful professional had been one of the assignment's unexpected benefits. Miss Lowell, Knox said, approaching with the respectful demeanor that had replaced his earlier arrogance. The new firing system modules arrived. Should we integrate them into next week's training schedule? Harper considered the timing, weighing the benefits of advanced equipment against her students' current skill levels. Teaching effective learning progression was as much art as science, requiring constant adjustment based on individual and group capabilities. Let's introduce them gradually. Martinez and her team can handle the advanced modules, but the newer specialists need more time with basic systems before we increase complexity. Knox nodded, making notes on his own clipboard. His acceptance of Harper's authority had evolved naturally over months of witnessing her expertise in action. The casual respect he showed her now felt genuine rather than obligatory, the acknowledgement of professional competence that Harper had earned through consistent demonstration of knowledge and skill. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the hangar floor, Harper called her class to attention for the day's concluding briefing. 20 faces turned toward her with the focused attention of personnel who'd learned that her instruction contained insights they couldn't find in manuals or standard training programs. Today's exercises demonstrated the importance of systematic troubleshooting and environmental awareness. Harper began, her voice carrying easily across the hangar's acoustic challenges. Remember that equipment failures in operational environments don't follow training manual scenarios. Your ability to adapt procedures to unexpected circumstances could determine mission success. She paused, letting her gaze move across faces that reminded her of her own early training years. Eager, confident, and not yet aware of how much they still needed to learn. Question for consideration. Why do we emphasize understanding system logic rather than memorizing response procedures? Martinez raised her hand. Because logic remains consistent even when circumstances change. But memorized responses might not apply to unexpected situations. Correct. Systems thinking enables adaptation. Rote memorization enables only repetition. Harper's teaching style emphasized principles that would serve her students throughout their careers, rather than just during their current assignments. Your homework assignment is to review the frequency modulation protocols we covered today and identify 3 scenarios where standard responses might be insufficient. Next week, we'll work through your scenarios using the new equipment modules. As her students gathered their materials and began to disperse, Harper remained in the hangar, watching them leave with the satisfaction of someone who'd found meaningful work after years of searching. The challenge coin in her pocket had become less of a talisman and more of a reminder, not of a past that needed hiding, but of experience that could serve the future. Captain Merrick appeared beside her, moving with the silent approach that had made him legendary among special operations personnel. "Ghost," he said quietly. "Ready for Norfolk?" Harper considered the question, weighing her confidence in the program she'd built against the appeal of new challenges and expanded responsibilities. 6 months ago, she'd been an invisible contractor trying to forget a past that felt like fiction. Today, she was a recognized expert preparing to share expertise that could save lives she'd never meet. "Ready," she said, and meant it completely. The hangar fell quiet as the last of her students departed, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of a military installation at rest. Through the open bay doors, Harper could see the flight line where FA-18s sat in perfect rows, their weapons pylons empty but ready. Once, she'd provided targeting coordinates for aircraft just like these. Now, she trained the people who maintained them, ensuring they understood not just the technical requirements of their jobs, but the human stakes that made their work matter. It felt like the completion of a circle, from operator to instructor, from classified shadow to recognized expert, from invisible contractor to valued colleague. The future stretched ahead with possibilities she was finally ready to embrace. Harper's journey from humiliated contractor to respected expert reminds us that everyone has a story worth telling, and that assumptions can blind us to extraordinary people living ordinary lives. Would you like another story?